Well, hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Haas, and I'm excited to welcome you to our third session of the California Preservation Next Academy, focused on property identification and evaluation. I want to just quickly review a few housekeeping items. Just a quick note, we are recording today's session, and we'll share the recording afterwards with all registrants. In addition, we are posting recordings online, and we'll share that link. It's the same link that you actually go to register for upcoming sessions. Today, we're asking that you use the chat for your questions throughout the presentations. We'll keep an eye on those and use them for our Q&A section. In addition, when we get to the Q&A portion of today's call, you will also have the opportunity to raise your hand, unmute, and ask questions verbally of our presenters. This is a meeting, so we're asking that you keep yourselves on mute when you're not speaking, because you do have that ability to mute and unmute. All right, I'm going to quickly now review our agenda. So next slide. So just to first give a quick recap on Preservation Next. What is the program? Why are we doing this? And where are we going next? We'll then jump into our content. Today, we are again focused on identifying and evaluating properties as you consider acquisition opportunities. And we're going to hear from three great speakers. First, we'll hear from Andrew Jakabovics with our National Policy Research Team, who will present some data on small to medium multifamily inventory nationally and in California. We'll then hear from Ruby Harris with Enterprise also to learn more about local tools in California to identify acquisition opportunities. And then we'll hear from a great guest speaker, Chris Cummings with the Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation, or TNDC, who will actually share with us TNDC's screening tool and process and a case study of how they've applied that tool. So a huge thank you to Chris for joining us today. We'll then do Q&A. Actually, I'm going to flip these two things, so you'll have that opportunity to ask questions in the chat and verbally. And then I'll close us out with a review of the Preservation Next toolkit and resources within that apply to today's session, and give you a quick preview of our January 12th session on financing. I want to give a big thank you to our funders, without whom this work would not happen: Mackenzie Scott, CIT Bank, and Kaiser Permanente. So now I'm going to give you a quick overview of Preservation Next for those that maybe are joining us for the first time. Preservation Next is Enterprise's national program focused on the preservation of small to medium multifamily affordable housing, as well as the housing stability of residents within. We're focused on this smaller stock, which for us is properties with 2 to 49 units. That upper limit is a little give or take, depending on the market. So sometimes we might go a little larger. But we know that these smaller properties are a critical source of affordable housing for low to moderate income households, and that these properties are at risk of loss due to market pressures, physical deterioration, and operational inefficiencies. Again, throughout our trainings, we're going to focus not only on the building stock itself, but also on how we can ensure the stability of residents so they can stay in this safe, stable, affordable housing for the long term. Preservation Next has been developed by a team across all enterprise divisions with input from local partners across our markets. I lead this work nationally along with Megan Volkovic as our senior advisor and Jesse Wang, a preservation fellow. Leading our California Preservation Next work, we have Caroline McCormack and Geeta Rao in our Northern California office, and Ruby Harris and Elizabeth Richards in our Southern California office. So now just going to highlight some of our upcoming and past sessions. Jesse did pop this link into the chat, where you can find recordings and PowerPoint slides and materials here on that website that she popped in the chat. You'll see that we've had 2 sessions on our 3rd session today, and then we've got sessions mapped out through June. This is a bit different. If you were on previous sessions, we've decided to expand the amount of time in between sessions just to give a little more time for digesting information. And we recognize this is a significant time commitment for folks. So the sessions do now go through June, but you can register for all sessions now. So now I want to talk a bit about what we're here today for. Today, we're going to focus on identifying and evaluating properties as you consider acquisition opportunities. We'll talk about how you might understand the small to medium multifamily inventory in your market, your area, as well as how to assess alignment of opportunities with your organizational priorities, capacity, and realities. So to briefly introduce our speakers, we're first going to hear from Andrew Jakabovics, who's our Vice President of Policy Development at Enterprise. Andrew oversees the policy development and research team, researching issues related to affordable housing, equitable housing and community development, housing finance, foreclosures, and more. And he spent a significant amount of time with other research partners at universities across the country, analyzing small multifamily properties ownership patterns. And he'll be sharing some data and information with us here today, nationally and for California. We'll also hear from Chris Cummings, who's the Director of Housing Development at TNDC. Chris is deeply passionate about affordable housing development and specifically around preservation strategies for their existing portfolio and other units. He's worked both on new construction and AC rehab, and previously led the development and execution of their portfolio recapitalization plan. So a huge thank you to Andrew and Chris for joining us today. So we are now going to pass the mic to Andrew to kick us off with data review.
Okay, I gotta get the video on 1 second. Okay, there we go. So we've got the right screen on, hopefully.
You do.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, Sarah. So I'm going to focus today on understanding the small and medium multifamily housing stock, just give a sense of the overview of the role that this property type, these building types play, both in the housing landscape from a supply perspective, but also from a demand perspective, understanding the kind of concentrations where they exist, et cetera. So with that, I will launch into the first slide, if this wants to cooperate. There we go. Okay, so nationally, and both within California and then more specifically within Los Angeles and the 9-county Bay Area, small and medium-sized multifamily properties are a critical source of rental homes. So what you see here is a distribution. They sum to 100%. So the top line is the national distribution of occupied homes by the size of the buildings. So not surprisingly, single family homes is the single largest category, and that's both attached and detached homes. And then all the way on the right side, you can kind of ignore the dark blue band, which is other, which is manufactured, as well as trailers, boats, etc. But the brown band on the right side are large multifamily buildings, which we define, and conveniently the census breaks out from 50 plus. So we use their categories for sake of consistency and ease of extracting data. But most folks are surprised to know that large multifamily properties are actually a fairly small share of the overall rental stock. When you ask people to kind of imagine a rental home, they assume that it is a unit in a very tall tower-like building. And in fact, in dense urban areas, that is the predominant type. But at the county level and nationally, we find that smaller homes, smaller buildings rather, with anywhere from 2 to 49 units are actually the predominant form of rental housing that exists. And so the colors in between the orange and the brown bands scale up based on the size of the building. So the dark blue is 2-family, 3 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 19, and then that purple swath is the 20 to 49, which if you kind of jump down to the LA line and even the Bay Area line, you can see that there's the distribution of smaller properties skews towards larger small properties, or sort of the medium-sized properties across both of the LA County and the Bay Area. California's numbers look fairly similar to the country overall, slightly more large multifamily properties, and the Bay Area also kind of has slightly more large multifamily properties relative to the nation as a whole. But in LA, I think it's important to recognize that 55% of the rental units that are occupied are in small and medium-sized multifamily properties. The Bay Area, it's a little bit less, it's about 50%, which is comparable to the national average. But again, those are kind of bounded on either side by a lower share of single-family homes being used for rental in the Bay Area, and a larger percentage than the national average of homes in large multifamily buildings. Again, thinking about some of the dense urban cores in those 9 counties. So we're going to focus kind of on that center part of the graph, and now understand what the pricing and what the markets look like for those smaller properties relative to either the single family homes available for rent or the larger buildings that are used for rental homes. So the national distribution, these are $200 increments, pretty much up to the maximum in the census. This is coming from the American Community Survey. So this is 2019 data tabled up. So obviously rents have risen significantly since that point. But since the rents have risen kind of comparably across the board, this should just give you a kind of a sense of the general distribution rather than focusing on the x-axis, right? So sort of just assume everything is kind of shifted upwards in some cases significantly. But as you can see, small multifamily properties skew towards being more affordable nationally, and we'll see that whole trend holds true both across all of California and within the two regions that we're focusing on today. Nationally, the kind of most prevalent rent is somewhere between $800 and $1,000 for small multifamily properties. That's also the peak, as it turns out, for single family homes, as well as large multifamily properties. But you can see the large multifamily properties kind of plateau. And so there's a wider spread of what kind of is the predominant rents. So they range really nationally between sort of $800 and $1,400. California, not surprisingly, is considerably more expensive than the country as a whole. That's not really the point I want to draw out today. I think it's one that everyone is definitely well aware of. But even in California, you can see that large multifamily properties, sort of that orange or golden band, that line there kind of peaks considerably higher than the small multifamily and medium multifamily properties do. But in California, that's sort of between $1,400 and $1,600 a month back in 2019. Compared to between $1,800 and $2,000 a month for larger multifamily properties. Single family homes also kind of extend over a wider range of prices. You can see that, excuse me, it's sort of at an elevated rate, the kind of that larger hump ranges anywhere from sort of $800 to about $2,000, and then sort of has a long tail up to the maximums. But the one of the challenges with single family homes is that, as we will see, that ownership is rather diffuse, and finding a single family home for rent can be more challenging. There also tend to be larger, which is great for families, but to the extent that where they do skew to be more expensive, affordability becomes a challenge for lower income households with large families. In the Bay Area, you can see, this is a good example in both the Bay Area and Los Angeles, the relative value offered by small and medium-sized multifamily properties. Again, you can see that the small and medium-sized multifamily, I'm just going to abbreviate it as SMMF. So just as I use that, just note that's what that stands for. It's on the slides and it saves, I don't know, about 15 to 20 seconds each time I say it. So, so the SMMF properties, again, in the Bay Area tend to be less expensive. You can see kind of jagged peaks for single family and kind of a plateau, and then another peak, really in the luxury space for large multifamily. And again, you can kind of see the extent to which the single family and large multifamily properties towards the right side of the Bay Area graph are really tends to be a much larger share, relatively speaking, of the overall rent distribution for those properties they're compared to the small medium-sized multifamily. In LA, the peak of SMMF is even more pronounced. You can see that a significant share is priced at or below $600 a month, and there's a cliff there, and by about 2,200, there's relatively little of the supply that's kind of on the more expensive side. Again, going back to 2019, we know those numbers have shifted, but you can see again that both the single family and large multifamily properties tend to be more expensive than the SMMF, which means that overall it provides a more affordable source of housing than either single family homes or large multifamily homes. We've actually done some research looking at the affordability of SMMF and have found that across multiple metro areas, even holding local conditions constant and tract level conditions constant, SMMF tends to sell to transact for less on an absolute basis or on a per square foot, a per unit basis or on a per square foot basis than either single family or multifamily. And that's kind of, I think, in part attributable to the rents, but there's also something attributable to the fact that small property transactions are harder to do, so it makes them less liquid. There's a number of theories that we have as to why these properties tend to be less expensive than larger properties or single family homes. That creates opportunities for affordability, but some of those opportunities are not always realized. So part of the question is ownership. And so understanding who owns these properties is, I think, an important component of figuring out an acquisition strategy for these smaller and medium-sized multifamily properties. So as you can see here, single-family homes that are used for rental, this comes from the Census and HUD's rental housing finance survey that's done every few years. This is specifically focusing, these are questions that are asked directly, surveys of owners of rental properties. Very rich survey if anyone wants to dig into some of the data. There's really, it's fascinating. There's a lot of good information out there. But we like to use it to understand just general ownership patterns and how they change over time. But so that you can see that again, these bars sum to 100%. So these are, so the numbers on each of the values are the number of thousands of properties that meet that category and that ownership type. So just to give you a sense of the scale, right? So if we kind of showed this another way, that the single family homes would absolutely dwarf all of the other types of properties. But overwhelmingly, about 3/4 of single family homes, and actually a slightly even larger percentage of 2 to 4 family homes that are used for rental are owned by individuals. And we define individuals as, the way it's reported out in the survey is individual investors, people who report owning as tenants in common, or own as a trustee of a trust. So if you have, a revocable trust, and we'll see this, some of these come up in the actual ownership data that we'll share a little bit later, but we see trusts are fairly common either for estate planning purposes or for retirement and things like that. So any of those categories we lump together as an individual investor or an individual owner. But then as properties get larger, not surprisingly, we see a shift towards more corporate ownership. And that corporate ownership, as you get larger, particularly in very large properties, is either an LLP, LLC type of arrangement, or REITs are much more common in the very large properties, again, because of the kind of the scale of operations that you're looking at and management, both the size of the investment as well as the operational challenges. They tend to, when they're making investments in multifamily properties, they tend to skew towards the largest types of buildings. Although you will note, which again will come as no surprise to anybody who's kind of on the ground, that we see, that golden slice in both single family homes as well as the 2 to 4s, which are also get financed similarly to single families, often get lumped together, and then small multifamily properties as well. There is kind of a prominent slice, not very large, and certainly gets a lot of attention of both in the 5 to 24 space as well, but almost no REIT ownership, although there is obviously a significant corporate ownership through LLPs, et cetera, in the single family and the SMMF space as well. And so we'll see that again in the list of owners coming up. So understanding kind of where these properties are is also, I think, important, again, as we sort of think about questions about risk of displacement, equity, and access and affordability. This is, on the left side is kind of the entirety of the county, the right side is sort of zoomed in, but you can see that there are sort of hot spots of where the SMMF properties are. And again, as we showed earlier, right, that's that significant concentration. You can see where those properties tend to be concentrated. There's kind of like an east-west swath kind of running sort of through the county there. As we'll see right now, that is actually not where on the left side is the share of Black-headed households. On the right side is the share of Latino-headed households, right? And the noticeable thing is that that sort of east-west swath of the more affordable stock, those small and medium-sized multifamily properties, is not the stock in places with high concentrations of either race or ethnicity. So I think that's important to recognize, both in terms of the implications for affordability, but also it's worth recognizing that not all small and medium-sized multifamily properties are used for rental, and particularly 2 to 4s are often historically have been a way to gain access not only to home ownership, but to generate some rental income for the homeowner. And so having access to that wealth building tool and those types of properties is noticeably absent in communities that have high concentrations of either Black or Latino residents. This pattern is not limited to Los Angeles. And in fact, if we look at the Bay Area, on the left side is the 9-county region, and on the right side, we kind of zoom into the inner ring of the Bay Area. You can kind of see this sort of literally this ring of small and medium-sized multifamily properties with the concentrations kind of ringing the Bay. And I think the interesting thing also is, again, to recognize the prevalence of these properties across the landscape, right? Obviously, there are certain communities, and obviously, San Francisco itself is a bright spot on the map, but throughout the entire region, right, there is actually a reasonable amount of these smaller properties. So as people think about new development, not just preservation in this context, but think about new development, kind of affordability and opportunities to create more affordable housing. We know that small and medium multifamily properties are the homes that tend towards affordability and become affordable over the long term because of their age. And if we're not producing more of them, they're not going to be around to be affordable. And they're often a helpful tool in thinking about creating conversations around gentle density and zoning reforms to open up land for slightly denser development that's still consistent with the neighborhood scale, and about creating opportunities in communities where there often aren't opportunities for lower and moderate income households to gain occupancy and residency. And again, the pattern that I was talking about in Los Angeles holds true here in the Bay Area as well. If we kind of jump back and forth, again, if it's sort of looking at where the ring of the concentrations of small and medium-sized multifamily properties are, right? Again, the noticeable absence in most cases of communities with high concentrations of those properties relative to where there are high shares of both Black or Latino households. So with that, kind of jumping back to the point I was making earlier about the opportunity for ownership and the implications, again, overwhelmingly SMMF house renters, but that doesn't mean that all residents of that property, those building types, are renters. And in fact, there are about 10% of the residents of 3+ unit properties, in fact, own basically in a condo or co-op structure. And then the 2s, the number in Los Angeles is about 20%. And in the Bay Area, it's closer to 30% of residents are actually co-owners, basically, right? So it's a 2-unit property, structure as a condo most likely, and both units are owned or occupied. Again, smaller properties, because we know they transact for less, particularly thinking about the 2s and the 3 to 4s, which can be financed in single family, is a way to potentially gain access to home ownership, either using the other units to either generate rental income or potentially to be turned around and sold in a condo structure to create home ownership opportunities for more than one household in a community. So thinking about the distribution between renters and owners in particular, right? Again, we know this again should come as a no surprise to anyone, but that renters are overwhelmingly less likely to have more likely to have lower incomes than homeowners do. And so again, the role that these smaller properties play in the housing stock is particularly important for those lower income households. And we know from other data sources that in fact, these smaller properties are where lower income households, both with and without public subsidy, I should mention, often find homes. And in fact, SMMF provide an outsized source of housing for households using housing choice vouchers. So that's, I think, just again important for us to recognize and understand the value that these SMF properties play for LMI households, and then thinking about the risk of displacement and the risk of loss, it becomes really important because if we cannot preserve these properties affordably, given the critical share of the overall stock and the affordable stock, the risk of displacement is exacerbated when these types of properties transact. So digging into, and this will be a transition to the other presentations, we've been looking at owners in a number of places, including in the Bay Area, and I'll share the LA analysis later. We've basically gone through, cleaned up the assessor data. This is data that we bought from a company called Regrid. It's not free, but it's very, very inexpensive relative to what you get. So this is not an advertisement for them. I'm just disclosing our data source. And I'll talk in a moment about other sources of data that are actually available publicly. But basically we go through, we clean it, we analyze both the names and the mailing addresses. We, as needed, also cross-reference state level corporations data to understand common ownership names and typologies, common threads on both the address side and the naming nomenclature to allow us to re-aggregate some of these portfolios. And you can see one of the things is that, included in this list is sort of like the top 20 owners by the number of parcels owned. And then the units are for San Francisco are actually what's reported by the assessor. For Alameda County, it's actually an estimate generated by Regrid. And I'm showing the average size here, right, which is really just units divided by parcels, to give a sense of the distribution, right? So some types of owners focus on the larger end of the scale, some focus on the smaller end of the scale. TNDC is on this list, and we'll be hearing from Chris shortly. But you can see that LLCs and trusts are kind of scattered throughout. Institutional investors, venture capital, et cetera. Veritas in particular is one that is the largest single owner in San Francisco, as far as we can tell. There are a number of trusts. The Archdiocese shows up on this list. So and again, this is sort of just the county of San Francisco. So this is not across the entirety of the region. But one of the things that we found actually interestingly is that owners tend to stay close to one geography. So they may operate across a county, but there's relatively little bleed over from county to county. When you get to some of the more further out counties, there's a little bit more crossover. And some of that, I think, speaks to both knowing the footprint of where you're acquiring and operating, but also some of the operational challenges particular to smaller properties where you're less likely to have an on-site property manager. And so the need to be able to manage across multiple sites speaks to the need for some degree of concentration, geographically speaking. But again, the fact that a number of mission-oriented affordable housing entities are listed on these lists in terms of the top levels of ownership speaks to the impact and scale that we're really trying to achieve by creating a sizable stock of deed-restricted affordable homes that help stabilize communities and residents as well. Shifting gears a little bit to Los Angeles, again, largest owners are corporate owners. There's some family trusts, a number of investment firms and the like. Interestingly, one of the things that we don't see in the Bay Area is actually individual owners. So if you kind of jump down to the middle, the Paul S. and Edith I. Ling, Kip C. and Amy L. Cypress, between them own about 100 homes, or rather 100 properties. And you can see, actually, interestingly, I added a column here on the right side, just a count of the number of zip codes in which these owners own properties. And again, some of these owners are concentrated. So if you look down to one of the mission owners, Abode, right, sort of a very clear focus in a small number of places, right? They show up across 4 zip codes. Community Corporation of Santa Monica, not surprisingly, right? 5 zip codes. Lancaster City Housing Authority is up there. They are in 2 zip codes, right? They're kind of obviously constrained. But some of the other owners really are operating across a much wider swath of the county. So with that, want to just kind of wrap up by talking about some of the data sources that we've used. So county assessors often make their data available, and it's really just a matter of Googling such and such county assessor data or parcel data. Open data sets, so you can also Google the county name and then open data. They'll often have a centralized repository for all county level data, which can then either be downloaded, usually like in an Excel or CSV format, so it's a flat file. But increasingly, counties have mapping tools that they make available online, so you can search by address, you can search by parcel number, etc., and can really zoom in and glean a lot of important information from the maps that are and those tools that are being made available. One sort of caveat about some of the publicly available data is that ownership data is not generally available from counties online. There's a state statute in California that says that the name and address of elected officials can't be published online. This is sort of an anti-doxing kind of thing. But because the assessors don't want to be in the business of trying to figure out who's an elected official and who's not, they basically just don't make any ownership data available online. But it is data that is in the land record, so it's available either in person through the assessor or by going to the recorder of deeds office, etc. And there are third parties, again, I mentioned that our data comes from Regrid, who have incorporated that ownership data into the data that they make available. There are other ways to kind of then aggregate piercing the LLC veil as it is. Open Corporates is a great website for that. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the Secretary of State Business Records is another searchable site that can list the name and addresses, et cetera, of the owners. So sometimes you get lots of levels of ownership, but in many cases, an owner of multiple properties uses a fairly standardized format for as a naming nomenclature, so they become somewhat easier to identify. And one of the tools I didn't mention here, but one of the tools that we use primarily for cleaning the ownership records is something called OpenRefine. It's an open source data tool that was originally developed by Google, openrefine.org, and it lets you kind of clean some of the messy data and deal with misspellings and the like. And then there, sorry, yes, sir.
I'm going to jump in. I'm sorry.
Okay. That's okay.
No, thank you for this amazing detailed information. Andrew, we do have some questions that are specific to some of the data presented.
Sure.
In the interest of time and keeping our flow going, I'm going to ask if you can check out some of them and answer them in the chat as we go. In addition, we will clarify some of these pieces before we send out slides to everyone after the session. So we will do a both and.
Awesome. I'll turn it to Ruby.
All right, thanks. Yes. We'll now pass to Ruby Harris, and we are going to hear about additional data sources and information specific to Southern and Northern California. So thank you, Ruby. And thank you, Andrew.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Sarah. So yeah, we're going to go through data sources here in California now. We want to start it out by passing the baton to you and ask that in the chat, if you can just let us know what data sources you use, both paid and free data that your organization uses to identify key neighborhoods that you want to work in or key properties. And I'll give just a couple seconds for you to put some information in the chat for each other. And then also, while we're talking today, just what other types of information do you see that are needed for the work that you're doing, and what would you like access to? And if you could throw that into the chat as we're speaking, that also gives us a good sense of sort of what we're missing. I'm going to be highlighting a couple of those pieces in a few minutes. So let's see. Well, I'll keep it moving, but put everything that you use to do your research in the chat, please. It was great. For one of the benefits here is that we can learn from each other. So I wanted to start out with California Housing Partnerships Affordable Homes at Risk report. This report comes out annually, and it gives us a really good idea of existing affordable rental homes that have been lost to the market or are at risk of being lost. So that's deed restricted homes, but they also have now started to track unrestricted SMMF. unsubsidized and unrestricted SMMF properties. And I'm going to go a little bit quickly here, but we are going to send out all of these resources later so you can dig further into them yourself. But one of the data limitations here that you're going to see across the board is that a lot of the data that we have available on the SMMF type are 5 units plus. And so the, output on the list of things we need is more information about the 1 to 4 units, and then just more detailed information about SMMF unsubsidized in general. So the next slide, we're just going to show you sort of one of the things that you can get out of the at-risk report, which is all available online. And this shows the top 12 counties in California that have the highest number and percentage of at-risk properties. And these specific on this slide are specifically deed restricted properties, already subsidized properties that are at risk of loss in the near future. Next slide. They also have a housing needs dashboard, which is what it sounds like. They are studying what the need is in a specific county. This is all county level information, what the need is against what is actually available out there. The housing needs dashboard also highlights market trends, any state and federal funding that is coming into a specific county, and then production that is happening in that county as well. Next slide. On the next slide here, this is an interactive tool, so you can really go in and look at the counties that you are concerned with. So we used Fresno as an example here. You can see in Fresno, there's 60,000 very low and extremely low income households who need rents that match their income. And you can see that we've got a deficit of 36,000 units that are available for them. So that's a really clear way of case making and making it clear of the amount of need that's out there. And then the other chart on the right-hand side shows that of all renters, 54% of all renters in Fresno are cost burdened in their housing. And then you can disaggregate the data and look at by race. So you can see all the way to the left of that chart that Black households, 75% of Black households are cost burdened. So you can really look at that and make your priorities in that way that is data driven. Next slide. And here are some local data sources. I'm going to go over some Bay Area and LA focused data sources. The UC Berkeley Urban Displacement Project mapping tool is actually a census tract level data, and where you can look at displacement trends, both what has already happened, how much displacement has already happened in a specific neighborhood, and also what neighborhoods are at high risk of displacement. You can look at eviction data there as well. It's good to use when you want to get more granular into your community. This also is not only for Bay Area, it's across all of California that this information is available for, and you can use this tool for. The Bay Area Equity Atlas looks at similar data, but through an equity framework, equity lens. You can look at people, place, and power data through an equity lens. And I really like to highlight the power piece, looking at voting trends, linguistic isolation. And they also have, looking at where people live in concentrations. And then finally here, we wanted to highlight the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project's Evictor book, which was on Andrew's last slide there. It's a web-based tool where you can actually, for San Francisco and Oakland, access specific property owner information, which includes any relationship of a specific property owner to other property owners. And because, as he mentioned, a lot of these are under LLCs, you can look up through that what other units are in their portfolio. You can look up their eviction history of evicting tenants. And it really is a tool that, tenant rights organizations and tenants can use in order to better understand the property owners in their area, currently only available in San Francisco and Oakland. And then next in LA, we've got data sources that the Los Angeles County Development Authority has put together a couple of really strong databases. They have tracked, which is mapping residential displacement and gentrification pressures throughout LA County. And then they have the affordability watch database, which also, which is specific to the developments that they have their own subsidy within. Both, and really is a tool for you to be able to see what's coming up and what's going to be expiring soon or maybe lost to the market in the future, and allow both the staff at the county level and any developers to start sort of thinking about how they want to recapitalize or those properties and keep them in the affordable stock. So those are currently only available internally to LACDA staff, but staff is open and they're available for you to contact them if you want to pull any specific track data there. Next slide. So it's sort of, how do we use these data sources? A lot of it Andrew already went through, but this is for, we want to offer these different types of data sources and what you all are sharing with each other in the chat, because we think it's really important to understand the market and where the properties are held in the neighborhoods that you're working in. So of course, you know your neighbors, you know what's happening as far as evictions and displacement go in your neighborhood. The loss of affordability, the sort of that constant drain, right? And so when you're talking to funders, lenders, electeds, you're talking about policy changes. These data sources really help take that real world experience and make that case as you're talking to others. So all of this is openly available to you. Next slide. Oh. So we're going to go into a poll really quickly. So Jesse, if you can launch the poll, we just want to find out, how do properties come to you? How do you find properties when you're out there searching for the right deal for your team? And I'll give just 20 seconds for that. Nice. Still waiting on half here. We've got brokers, MLS, tenant advocates up front right now. Two more seconds. All right, so can we show the share results? All right, so you can see here, I hope everybody can see here, that MLS brokers were the most popular. Tenants and tenant advocates, we're going to talk about all of these shortly. Sellers are pretty far up there, with a third of them coming from sellers. The Community Opportunity to Purchase Act, which gives the first right to community nonprofits and tenants, and then other. If you indicated other, we would love to hear more about what you mean by other in the chat. And moving forward, thank you so much for sharing that. Next slide, please. So we're going to go through sort of some of those ways that properties find their way to you. There were the standard sources like realtors and the multiple listing service, which most of you are very aware of. And then there's also paid services like CoStar and Property Radar, where you can actually do a little bit more digging and pull data, put out, pull reports for neighborhoods and on properties that you're very interested in. We often see that tenants and tenant rights organizations, they know the most about what's happening in their neighborhood and in their building. So tenants are going to be the first ones who know what's happening. The seller is sort of around the building a little bit too much and looking at selling, or in contact with them in some other way. And so that's a great way to get information about up and coming properties and maybe make a transaction off before it hits the market. And then we've got the default and foreclosure listings, which you can pull off of Property Radar. Just keep in mind that it'll be only 5+ unit buildings if you're doing that. Or you can work with your county to obtain that information for free. And then there's Public Spotlight. So the picture here is the Mom's House in Oakland. There's many projects that come along because of tenant advocacy or other types of advocacy that ends up with a large number of media coverage. And it's really important as developers in this space to just be ready when a project comes available and be there to sort of help support our neighbors. And then public officials going through a public process to put a spotlight on a specific project. And then finally, as these programs become more readily available and accessible, and people have knowledge of them, sellers come forward, especially sellers who are very community minded and have a stake in their neighborhood and want to sell and get out of the property for whatever personal reason. But they also want to protect their tenants and are hopeful to have the property move on to a nonprofit owner. So those are all ways of identifying SMMF properties. And then finally here, another great way is to really collaborate with your local jurisdiction. We talked a little bit about the default and foreclosure lists and some of the key city, county databases that are out there now. But one of the things you can do in San Francisco is become a qualified nonprofit under the COPA, the Community Owner Opportunity to Purchase Act. Sorry about that, COPA. And if so, you will get first dibs at properties that are becoming available in San Francisco. The state also, there are noticing requirements for any projects that have federal funding and are going to be losing their restrictions soon. And so both the tenants and your local jurisdiction will be receiving notices 1 year out and 6 months before those expire. Your local jurisdictions are very interested in keeping these within affordable housing ranks. And so having that relationship with your jurisdictions is a great thing to keep in mind. And then both in San Francisco and Los Angeles, there are property level data information systems where you can pull any permit, history, you can pull transaction history, owner history, tax history, lots of really rich information that is available to zoning. All of that good stuff is available sort of online and easy to access. I did a quick search of other cities as well. It varies depending on the city, what's available online, but obviously all of this is also public information that you can pull in person if you need to in your city. And I will stop there and see if there are any, am I taking a question, Sarah, or should I move forward?
Yeah, let's go ahead and go forth and we'll cover
Okay.
anything in the Q&A part. Thanks.
All right, sorry, we're a little talk heavy right here, but I'm gonna pass it on to Chris, who's gonna talk about more project level decision-making.
Yeah, hi everyone. Chris Cummings from the Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation. Let me just pull up my PowerPoint presentation. Just give me a second here. Okay. Okay, so again, Chris Cummings from the Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation. For those of you who are unfamiliar with TNDC, we are an affordable housing developer, owner, and operator in San Francisco. And despite the fact that a lot of our housing work is directly on ground up new construction, TNDC actually got our start in the early 1980s doing acquisition preservation work as our kind of sole means of providing affordable housing to the community. And acquisition preservation is a really integral part of our overall housing development strategy today. TNDC, typically what we try to do is we look for larger and medium-sized properties, maybe like 50 to 60 plus units. But TNDC does own and operate a lot of SMMF properties. And if all the metrics kind of align the way we want them to, we would certainly be open to acquiring smaller properties as well, because those are really an important part of the overall preservation strategy up here in San Francisco. Again, the buildings we look at, a lot of them are older single room occupancy properties in and around the Tenderloin and South of Market neighborhoods. To Ruby's poll question earlier of how we actually find these opportunities, number one of the greatest tools we have here in the city of San Francisco is the COPA process. That's the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act, in which TNDC is a qualified nonprofit. And we get first look at the listings and then the right of first offer to be able to move forward some of these projects and acquire them and add them to our portfolio. That's just a tremendous tool up here in San Francisco, and I hope it starts expanding across the state. Also, we have a broker, who's laser focused, really understands the metrics and criteria we're looking for in our building acquisitions, and will bring those opportunities directly to us as well. We we've had a bit of a lull in our acquisition preservation work over the past 2 years. And what we did at TNDC is we really took an opportunity to kind of like assess and develop our own acquisition strategy program so that we could hit the ground running when new opportunities and new funding have arrived here in the city. So really my goal for today is to kind of share a little bit about our acquisition preservation strategy with you folks, and more specifically, number one, how we assess these opportunities, and number two, how we can actually make informed consensus-based decisions on moving these projects forward. So, and before I kind of get into the meat of that, I just want to kind of present one of our biggest challenges here at TNDC related to that question. And I think it'll probably resonate with a lot of folks here. So TNDC, in addition to doing housing development, we provide our own property management, our own tenant community services, our own asset management, et cetera. And even though housing development is involved in these projects at the front end, it's really these other departments within TNDC that are responsible for owning and managing and maintaining these properties in the long run. So their input into the process and into what properties we actually want to acquire is pivotal. And then the other challenging piece here is that, their time and their capacities to help make decisions is limited. So really one of the big questions that we were tackling over here at TNDC, and many of you might also be, is, these opportunities come so quickly and we have limited time and capacity to focus on them. So how can we actually make consensus-based decisions on the right opportunities quickly and accurately? And again, this is just a big challenge that we've been focusing on over the past 2 years. The two solutions that we've come up with here at TNDC is, number one, we formed a committee. TNDC loves forming committees for a whole multitude of different things. And we actually put together what we call our acquisition strategy group. That includes a lot of members from our property management, services, asset management departments that are directly, impacted by the acquisition opportunities that we pursue. And really, this acquisition strategy group is the kind of governing decision-making body of which properties we want to actually move forward with in terms of acquisition. And then kind of coming out of that group, we put together our own assessment tool, a very comprehensive assessment tool to really assess the right opportunities and inform the kind of the go or no-go decision-making process. And I'll kind of get into a little bit more detail around what that rubric looks like. And before I do that, I just want to quickly pause and I want to talk about the acquisition life cycle and where our go, no-go decision kind of fits into that process. So I've kind of just put together this quick graphic here. This is a very typical acquisition life cycle for TNDC, and it may vary by organization depending on how you approach your acquisitions. But we kind of start off in the opportunity area, which could be a month or two. That's when a listing comes before us, either through a broker or the COPA process. And then we would move into negotiating a contract, going into physical due diligence, closing on the project, and then taking over the property into operations and kind of doing our initial rehab, which is typically what we like to do. And during this acquisition life cycle, there's a multitude of decisions that need to be made by a multitude of different parties at TNDC, including our board of directors and other groups. But really the area that I want to focus on today for assessment really falls in between like this opportunity stage that I mentioned and making a go or no go to move it to the next stage of negotiating a contract. And really the important piece here is that this marks a really significant threshold where once we say go at this opportunity stage, then we really start spending staff time and staff resources and financial resources on our projects. And I've kind of added this other element here. This is a very now crowded graphic, but you can kind of see that after we pass the go or no go stage, then we start spending more time and money on the contract and physical due diligence. Then we decide, yep, we want to keep moving forward with closing. That adds more time and money. And then finally, when we decide to close, that represents a project that's fully financed, and we're kind of 100% all in terms of staff resources and our financing for the project. And on that note about costs, I'm sharing this table with that kind of represents a typical breakdown of costs that TNDC would incur once we pass the that go decision all the way through physical due diligence on a property. And you can see, this is San Francisco prices up here, so it might be a little bit skewed, based on others across the state. But this can represent nearly $200,000 of initial investment just to take a quick look at a property. And, oftentimes what we'll do is once we sign a purchase and sale agreement, we'll put in a refundable deposit. So in case the project doesn't actually move forward, we would get that $100,000 refunded. But really all of the other costs on this table, these are the consultants and attorneys and other folks that we work with to kind of uncover what's happening at the property during due diligence. And ultimately, if we don't move forward with the project, we would, those costs are effectively sunk costs. We don't get those reimbursed. And so we kind of, TNDC, what we do is we kind of determine that that's what we call risk capital, money that we could risk on a potentially good opportunity that might not get reimbursed in the future. And so TNDC is very, very, focused on how much we want to spend in risk capital on each project and how much risk capital we want to expend across a bunch of different projects in a given year. And I would encourage other, folks around the table here to really make sure your organizations are thinking about that. I have to say that TNDC has been in a few different acquisition opportunities where, we put a lot of money and time and effort into it, and we did not move forward with it. And, we did lose this risk capital, but, even though we lost that money, all is not lost because we do learn a lot from failed acquisition opportunities, and then we use those lessons learned in the future. Okay, so now kind of getting into the nuts and bolts, this is really where I want to talk about this assessment tool that TNDC has put together. And for folks on this call, Enterprise has agreed to share this out with everybody on this call. And, you can feel free to use it to kind of help develop your own strategies at your organizations. But ours is very comprehensive. We spent a lot of time on this. It actually has 42 total categories at this point. We're always adding and subtracting and ever changing it, but 42 categories for how we assess potential acquisition opportunities. That can range from neighborhood and location to amenities in the neighborhood, population served, and percent of the population at risk. To Ruby's point earlier, we use the Berkeley Displacement Project to understand the dynamics of displacement in the neighborhood or location of the property. Another, some really other important ones for us are having the property align with our mission and strategic plan. Also making sure that it's a financially feasible project. And also as part of this assessment tool, TNDC ensured that we had a kind of a metric for measuring success for each of these categories, so that we all were on the same page about what was epic for TNDC, meaning best case scenario, and where a property might actually fail or become a failure in a particular category because it's not meeting our minimum standard. And so, the rubric tool that we have, it's a big Excel workbook. Again, Enterprise will share that out with folks on the call today, but I kind of took a snip of it to kind of show you how we set it up and how we developed it. You'll kind of see on the top row, those are the main categories for which we assess different properties. And then on the left-hand side, that's kind of our success metric. Again, epic, target, minimum, or failure. And so what we did as a group is we laid out all of these 42 categories. Again, it's a lot of categories. And then for each of those categories, we populated the criteria that would represents where the criteria falls on that success metric. So kind of an example here, under our mission alignment, preservation and prevention of displacement is really important for us. So our epic goal for at risk or displacement would be, being able to preserve 50% or more of the existing households that might be at risk. Whereas failure might just be a property that has no opportunity for preservation of at-risk populations. Okay, and I just want to now kind of change over to a case study. This is kind of a real-life project that TNDC is currently working on, and I kind of want to explain how our assessment tool and decision-making process kind of factored into this particular property. This is actually a pretty big building in the Tenderloin in San Francisco. It's 97 units. And one of the reasons why this property is such a good opportunity for TNDC is because it's 75% vacant. The current landlord is using it for corporate rentals and Airbnb rentals, of which there's not a significant market for right now. So TNDC can take advantage of this and really program those units in terms of income targeting and serving low and very low income populations right off the bat, right? So there's this huge opportunity to have housing for low income and very low income populations here in the Tenderloin through this acquisition. Also, the building is in really good condition. and is almost in near like turnkey condition. So we don't expect a lot of immediate needs to happen up front. We learned about this opportunity through the COPA program, which I mentioned earlier. And right now we're at kind of the opportunity stage where we're examining if this is a good decision for us. And so what we've done so far is, we're kind of taking this opportunity for a free look at the property. We've conducted a site visit. I brought folks from our acquisition strategy group along that can kind of have a keen eye on things for what matters to them most about these properties. And we're kind of formulating how we might put together an offer for this. So kind of in this free look stage, what I've done for our acquisition strategy group is I've populated that rubric tool. And I'm just kind of sharing the results right here, of the categories that we have information on or that are applicable to this property. Most of them fall into the EPIC and or target and minimum, standards. But interestingly enough, 4 of the categories actually represent a failure for TNDC. But I do want to make sure that folks understand that even though we fail in 1 or more categories, that does not mean that we would not move forward with the acquisition, because this one is actually, the group decided that this was a go opportunity for us, and we're moving forward with putting forward an offer. The failures, what we have to think about when we see failure is what's the trade-off of moving forward with the acquisition if we fail. And an example here is, one of our subcategories related to physical condition of a building is, does it have outdoor space for resident health and exercise and potentially growing healthful foods? This property, being in the Tenderloin, does not have any outdoor space for that. So it did constitute a failure. However, the trade-off is that it's close to a public park and that has some really nice open space inside of the building, like hallways and common areas that represent opportunities for resident exercise. So again, just because we fail in some areas does not mean that this is not a good opportunity for TNDC to take action on. So, kind of coming out of this case study and, putting together this acquisition strategy and rubric, I wanted to kind of just share with this group some lessons learned and takeaways that TNDC has encountered that might help you either expand your existing program or start one brand new. And I also wanted to share how strategic partnerships with other affordable housing developers or organizations can play in a really important role here. And I'll kind of just start with the partnerships piece. One of the main areas where we can find partnerships, TNDC in particular for acquisitions projects, are through traditional joint venture agreements where we're partnering with another organization that's bringing something to the table, and we're bringing something to the table, and we're jointly working on acquiring, rehabbing, and owning and maintaining a property in the long term. And really the important piece here is ensuring that partnership is reciprocal, right? TNDC might look for an opportunity in a neighborhood that we have zero experience working in. And in that case, we might say, it's a big risk for us to be able to enter a community that doesn't know TNDC. So therefore, we'll partner with an organization that has roots in the neighborhood. They can kind of bring that community development piece to us. And maybe they don't have a lot of experience doing acquisition rehab. And that's how TNDC can kind of help build their capacity through this joint venture. Again, some areas where we might fail on our assessment rubric, that could be the trade-off, could be entering into a partnership to kind of fill in some of those gaps. Capacity building and knowledge sharing, huge in San Francisco. Again, we have this COPA process. We have a group of, I think, almost 20 qualified nonprofits as part of that. We're constantly sharing opportunities with each other. I know that CCDC, Chinatown Community Development Center, is looking into Chinatown. If I see a good opportunity, I'll share that with them. We share pro forma templates. We share cost estimates from other rehab projects with each other. Just a really good opportunity to work with existing organizations in your own neighborhoods to build your own capacity and build capacity of others. And then there's also strength in numbers. That case study I shared, that's actually part of a 4-property portfolio that one seller is putting forward. And, we're teaming up with 1 or 2 more organizations to take down all 4 of those properties at once, which could, potentially give us volume discount here, right? The owner says, hey, let's offload all these properties now. We might get volume pricing. And there's also economies of scale and working together to do this portfolio takedown. So again, strength in numbers with other organizations, super important in this work for us. Then finally, just some other strategies to take away for folks here. I would, love for folks to consider developing your own assessment tool or framework for which you assess these opportunities and make these important go or no go decisions. Feel free to use TNDCs. It's not going to be an exact model you can follow because we have very specific needs, but a lot of the nuts and bolts and guts of how we think about acquisitions can definitely be translatable to your work. Develop an internal decision-making body. Again, we have an acquisition strategy group. It's 8 to 10 members. We meet monthly. It is a big time commitment for folks in your organization, but the time spent now coming up with a strategy is going to save you a ton of time in the future from either spinning your wheels on a project that just does not make sense for your organization and potentially expending a lot of your own capital and outlaying a lot of your own capital on properties that don't make sense to move forward with. Utilize your existing organization resources. I mentioned for that case study that we get a kind of a free look site visit at the front end. I always bring people from our facilities team over. They look at the boiler system, they look at the roof, the windows. That's kind of like our, instead of paying a consultant to do that and wasting time and money there, we're kind of like honing in our own resources within our organization that don't cost us money. There's opportunity cost, of course, but kind of get their keen expert eye on it to help inform the go and no go and populate that assessment rubric. And then finally, utilize data and lessons learned from other projects. I've mentioned that TNDC has been in the due diligence phase and has not moved forward with acquisitions in the past. But again, we always kind of do this post-mortem meeting and understand all of the lessons we learned from that acquisition that did not move forward and apply those lessons learned to new prospective projects. Again, really important way for us to not make the same mistakes again and take what we learned from other properties and make sure we're doing it right on the next one. And that concludes my presentation. Again, I think TNDC has come a long way in our acquisition preservation strategy. It's been like an all hands effort from folks at our team, and I'm really happy to share any more lessons learned or encourage you guys to use our rubric tool to kind of develop your own. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. That's great. We are now going to spend some time with questions. So I'm going to bring Andrew back up, keep Chris, Ruby, and myself. There we go. All right, cool. So let's jump in. Ruby and I will pop out a couple questions, but if anyone in the audience would like to come off mute and ask a question, you are welcome. Just raise your hand and we will find you. So I will maybe kick us off. Andrew, I'm going to start with you. While our academy as a whole is very focused on the development community, we also have folks on from local government, advocates, and others. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the public sector or other data intermediaries might make this information that's needed more accessible, understandable,
Sure.
and actionable.
Wow.
This is your moment.
I love that question. Yeah, no, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, right? This is data that, belongs to the public, is in the public record. There's actually a long history of public access to land records, going back to the 1600s in this country. I mean, it was one of the earliest passages of laws, I believe, in Massachusetts when it was still a colony. I wrote actually a column for Shelter Force about this over the summer, about the importance of public access to this data and why knowing who owns in your community is actually really important. And I think that we lack good tools that are publicly accessible, right? If you kind of think about what some of the private sector actors are doing in terms of buying, this data that's available for sale, right? So having more of it available freely is great and really important. Real time in addition, which is something that we don't quite have access to. We get fairly close, but not quite real time, as we've seen from some of the comments in the chats, right? Some of the comments around foreclosures and things moving through various processes. But it's messy, right? So like LLC, something as simple as that, right, may be spelled L period, C period, maybe L space C, maybe LLC, right? And if you just sort of try and create a pivot table with that in Excel, right, which is already like a degree of difficulty in Excel for folks who don't use it regularly, right? Like that's not that's non-trivial. So one of the things that OpenRefine is really great about doing is that it does fuzzy pattern matching. It sort of runs a whole bunch of algorithms in the back and lets you actually sort of nicely clean this really messy data, right? So even things also thinking about, right, some of those trusts that show up as, first name, last name, first name, middle initial, not middle initial. And it's fairly good about identifying all of those and kind of allowing us to reconsolidate and identify kind of some of the ownership names. When actors are buying under multiple names, right? So like 123 Main Street, 125 Main Street, 127 Main Street, et cetera. Those are, you're not going to be able to smush those together, right? But often buyers of a certain scale will actually have a common mailing address. So kind of iterating between name nomenclature and mailing address lets you kind of reconsolidate and figure out who's who. But having tools that let you do that in the public domain, I think is really powerful and really important. And to the extent that, now sort of speaking to the public sector folks here, right, to the extent that you can put together some of those kinds of tools for stakeholders, I think that's really powerful and really important to gain, really to kind of level the playing field, because the folks who have deep pockets can hire lots of smart folks to go out and do this all day long, right, and can afford to place lots of bets even when they go badly. And too often when they go badly, right, it's the community that's ultimately left holding the bag for, a bad investment when they walk away from things. So I think that having those tools in the public domain, so it's not just having the access to the data, which has gotten infinitely better than it was even a few years ago in terms of using open data platforms and things like that. But then the next stage is creating the public tools to do those kinds of analyses, to understand who's in your community, who's operating in your community, to think about, like, how do you engage with them, right? Are they local themselves, right? Is there a neighborhood cohort of owners that could be brought together to build power, to talk about beautifying the community, to strengthen the community, to stabilize the community, right? As opposed to it's a bunch of arm's length investors who are just, hopping on any one of a number of platforms, sitting on a lounge chair somewhere elsewhere on a beach and who knows what, right? Like, be like, oh, I'm going to buy 12 properties today. Some of that is not happening as much now just because of where interest rates have gone, the market school, et cetera. But like being aware that that's sort of how folks can operate, right? And making sure that the tools are available to kind of level that playing field, I think is really, really important. So more data and more tools. That's my charge.
Thank you, Andrew. Chris, I'm going to ask you a question that came through on the chat while you were speaking. At what point in the acquisition process do you complete the checklist? And if it's earlier in the process, how do you still make a go, no go decision, even though there are some unknowns?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that was I have to say that TNDC kind of learned from experience where, maybe we moved too quickly into a project and realized, oh, we didn't really know what we were getting ourselves into, and then kind of said, oh no, this is the time that we need to kind of assess what we did wrong the first time and put together this rubric. So again, what we try to do here is we try to get as much information to inform a decision before spending a lot of time or money. And so we really try to milk that for as much as we can. We get our free site visit. We bring the whole TNDC family on board. We try to get as much info from the seller, like rent roll, historical operating costs. We go to public records to see if there's any like notices of violation on the building or what the repairs that happened through the building department. And again, so then what we're trying to do is fill out as much of that rubric as possible at that stage. And then based off of that, we have some knowns and then we still have some unknowns. And then we have to kind of make an informed decision about, well, if it's a go, how do we answer those unknowns? And that's where we really like we rely on our professional consultants. Unfortunately, like seismic can kill a good preservation project in San Francisco. We look at these old historic buildings in the Tenderloin. Seismic can be really expensive, can be a huge risk to our residents and our staff in the building. So oftentimes we don't know the seismic condition of the building at this free stage. We can kind of infer from other properties we've seen, but that becomes one of the big unknowns that we want to tackle like head on as part of our due diligence phase if all the other metrics are working out.
Great. And so just one more question that's related. So for a smaller developer who has a little less capacity to go through the full, that level of detail, are there specific aspects of the evaluation tool that you would tell them to focus on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And fortunately, I did see that in the chat and thought it was a very, very nice question. So I kind of wrote down the big four that, well, let me step back for a second. First of all, regardless of your capacity, I would definitely encourage you to kind of have at least 1 or 2 round tables with your other stakeholders in your organization, because, I'm a housing developer, and I always have my real estate hat on. And like my first answer is like financial feasibility, right? And physical conditions of the building, because that's really what I care about. And when I had these roundtables with this acquisition strategy group, people were bringing things to light that I hadn't necessarily been thinking about with my real estate hat on. And that was a really important step for us. So that's when we really started to unpack what is TNDC's mission, what's our strategic plan and strategic framework, and how do these acquisition opportunities fit into all that good stuff that are in these frameworks. So that really forced me to step back and think about the mission connection, and the population we're trying to serve. So, I think, the big two from a real estate perspective for me are always financial feasibility and physical condition, because that informs how much rehab or seismic risk there might be for a property. But then also making sure that you're talking to the other folks in your organization to get the mission fit and the other kind of qualitative pieces that the housing development team might not necessarily be thinking about.
That's great. Thank you. Another question we had on data access, and this, I think, Andrew, you or Chris or Ruby, you may even know. We had a few folks share that they're really interested in better and more accessible data on foreclosures, and wondered if there were recommendations around data that is more, I guess, frequently updated and accessible for folks who are trying to take advantage of opportunities.
I mean, so this is something that I think we are needing to build out and get a little bit more accurate on, especially with FIP coming down the pipeline. When I was with the city of San Francisco, I worked very closely with our assessor recorder's office, and they would feed us sort of early default notices and stuff early on, so that we would have a little bit of a head start as we're getting towards that. It's all public information, but takes time to get through their whole process. And so that's why I was mentioning, just to get really close to your recorder's office is a good thing to do. And it's public information that you can access. And then there will be sort of other opportunities, although less so in California than in other states, to work along with lenders who might be seeing large amounts of foreclosures happening, and who are looking for solutions to that as well. I've seen that strategy also.
Great, thank you. Just want to remind folks in the audience, if you'd like to jump in with a question, feel free to raise your hand and you can unmute and jump in. Another question, Chris. This is a kind of, I guess, bigger picture, broad question. So you talked about TNDC's origins and preservation, but then a shift away, kind of maybe now a turn back, at least to a point. Can you talk a little bit about that decision making, why the shift away, and now why kind of returning some to the preservation space?
Oh yeah, I think I think TNDC's housing development strategy started as preservation, again, to try to get as many properties preserved as affordable in and around the Tenderloin as is being and is still being gentrified today. And then we kind of started our new construction arm too, but we've really been kind of dual tracking those over the past few years. I mentioned that we had a bit of a lull in our acquisition preservation work as we were waiting for a new pot of money from the city and county of San Francisco. That's when we took the opportunity to really do some nuts and bolts thinking about what our acquisition strategy is. So I think we're still true to our history and what we want to do and where we want to preserve buildings in the Tenderloin. But we also wanted to think about, well, what if we do want to go into the Mission District in San Francisco? Or what if we want to kind of break into the West Side, the Sunset and Richmond districts in San Francisco, where there's not a lot of affordable housing and there's a huge need for it. So we really needed to stay true to our roots of the Tenderloin, and that was the case study that I provided, but also start thinking about where we want to invest in and allocate other resources for new opportunities here in San Francisco. Again, we haven't broken out of San Francisco yet. I'm not sure that TNDC will, but we're really trying to keep our options open about different geographies, neighborhoods, and populations that we might serve through this work.
There was a question in the chat, and I actually don't know the answer to it, so I'm curious if anybody else does, about the availability of information, like displacement information in native and tribal lands. And I'm wondering if there's a different data set, Andrew, where that kind of information can be found. So I'm not sure. I can definitely follow up later with whether or not it's included in the CHP numbers, but other than that, where would we find information on tribal lands?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't know the extent to which that's reflected in the assessor data, just in terms of parcel ownership, right? Like it may not be available below the tribal land level, right? Either it's excluded entirely or it's just treated as a single block. I don't know. It's not something I've looked into, but it's a great question.
Yeah, we can definitely check in with our group who focuses on that at Enterprise and get back to the group.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Ruby. All right, I think we have time for maybe one more question. Chris, I'm going to throw this one to you. Just a kind of final recommendations or thoughts on practices other organizations could adopt to streamline and strengthen their ability to identify and evaluate properties for acquisition. Just kind of a final recommendations, especially for some of our emerging organizations on the call today.
Yeah, I saw a lot of questions in the chat about like, how we make decisions on how much money we want to expend or how much staff time we want to expend. So I think that's an important piece. But, again, I think my two big recommendations are develop a tool like TNDC has now. Other organizations, I think Meta brought one to the table at one of our first trainings that wasn't necessarily at this no-go stage, but was really important in their decision-making process and continuum of decisions that need to be made. So I would make a tool. I would bring as many people from your organization around the table that you think would have input on what types of acquisition projects you might want to take on. I would also encourage organizations to think about how much kind of risk capital you're willing to expend on an annual basis. And then that could inform how many projects you might want to chase after. So like, again, what TNDC did was we don't want to make the mistake of committing to spending $50,000 to $75,000 on consultants if we don't pass go, to steal a monopoly term. If we don't pass that go mark, we don't want to spend a lot of money and use a lot of our time on these projects. So it's like getting the tool and at least checking off a lot of those boxes to get to feasibility, and then saying, yeah, we found 3 properties in a given year that met this criteria, and that's kind of our maximum tolerance in terms of cost that we might expend on an annual basis for this work. So again, start with get your organization together, put together a tool, and then figure out what your tolerance is around money and time spent on these projects. And I think that'll be a really good start.
Thank you, Chris. Well, a huge thank you to Chris and Andrew and Ruby for presentations and answering questions today. Just so folks know, we've been tracking all the questions in the chat, and anything we didn't get to verbally, we'll make sure to follow up on in our email when we send out materials and recordings and all that good stuff. So I'm just going to close us out now. So I think we're going to pop the PowerPoint back up for a moment. We're just 5 minutes out. Awesome. Thank you, Jesse. So just want to highlight some sections of our Preservation Next toolkit, and we'll pop the link to the toolkit in the chat as well. This is the online preservation toolkit, which is free and available for use for anyone across the country. And I just want to highlight some of the sections which apply to our content today. So first, we do have a couple of sections that are really focused on data. We have some national data. It's in the small to medium multifamily housing by the number section. Provides quantitative national data on small to medium multifamily housing stock. It includes characterization of the stock itself, how it's changed over time, demographic characteristics of residents and conditions in neighborhoods. So you'll find graphs, charts, all that good stuff to support some case making in your community as you're engaging in this work. The next spot you can check out is the state of the market briefs. And this is where you'll find information that's specific to different regions across the country in which enterprise works. So you'll find the Los Angeles state of the market brief, as well as one for Northern California. We've got some data information, as well as information on kind of the enabling environment and partners engaged in the work. We've then got 2 issue briefs focused on aligned content. First, the one titled Identifying Small to Medium Multifamily Properties for Preservation covers identification and evaluation of properties and highlights some critical characteristics you may want to consider, kind of again in alignment and connection to what we discussed today. You'll find some interactive content as well as some reflection questions you can use to kind of guide your thinking in this work. The acquisition section of the toolkit will cover the acquisition process, different steps one will engage in, including considerations you should take into account and challenges you may face in the work. And then lastly, just want to again highlight our case studies, which enable you to see real acquisition and rehab opportunities that have happened to better understand how partners have identified and vetted those opportunities. A couple of I want to highlight are 700 Simmons Avenue in Barcelona apartments. That one's from TNDC. And these case studies really highlight the role of resident engagement in identifying and understanding properties. So again, it's not just the data, that's obviously really important, but it's also understanding the community and understanding and engaging with the folks that live in these properties. So just to also, I want to preview our next session. We're going to take a little break for the holiday season. Please join us on January 12th. We'll talk about financing small to medium multifamily preservation. We'll preview the downloadable financial modeling tool available via the Preservation Next Toolkit and talk about California local, regional, and statewide resources and realities in financing these properties. So again, just want to thank everyone so much for joining us today. A huge thank you to our presenters and participants. Again, just really appreciate all the engagement, the great questions and conversation. We will follow up with recordings, PowerPoint slides, and materials. Just give us probably a week or so to pull everything together, but and we recognize we also owe folks for session 2. We're just waiting on a couple documents. So again, thank you so much. Have a great December break. Hopefully some folks have a little time off planned, and we'll see you in January. Bye, guys.